Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the PB&J podcast. We have a special episode for you today. We are talking about the Church of the Nazarene's position relating to alcohol. But before we dive into it, if you like this episode, go ahead and hit a like. If you have anything you want to say in response to what we say throughout this episode, leave a comment. Be sure to share this if you want to share it. And if you're not subscribed, or if you don't follow us, go ahead and do that. You can also reach out to us now. We have social media up. You can find us at PB&J Podcast on Facebook. You can also find us on Instagram at official.pbj podcast. And you can also reach out to us through email, official.pbjpodcast@gmail.com. So that being said, getting all the social media stuff out of the way, this topic is a pretty big one. And even though we are talking specifically about the Church of the Nazarene stance, there are other denominations that have a stance on alcohol, and especially in the States, because that's our context. This is one of those subjects that is fascinating because it's one that is relevant, it's timely. For a lot of people, it makes a big difference in terms of whether or not they want to be involved in a church, but it's also one that no one seems to want to talk about. Like from, your average layperson to even like church leaders, like no one really talks about this. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, Jordan, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I might say that once you're done listening to this podcast, you could be considered an expert on this subject. And that's not a way of me building up like our level of expertise. That's just me saying that's how little it's talked about within the Church of Nazarene.
Okay, yeah.
So, yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
I
mean, it's
would
true.
say
Like
that's
the stuff.
probably fair. I don't think I've had a lot of conversations about this. For me, it was something we just didn't discuss growing up at all. This was a thing that we didn't talk about, and then it was this. I mean, you get like a service level reason, but it was usually your parents saying something, and so you don't. Having said that, most of my family are affiliated with Church of the Nazarene Free Methodist Church, so the entirety of almost all my family growing up didn't believe in any kind of drinking. So I'm interested to kind of get into some of the reasons, because I haven't really had, outside of our prep, a real chance to discuss them, because it just wasn't a thing we talked about, like I said. No, but you'll be an expert. You'll be an expert because no one talks about it. And I was trying to give an anecdote why that made sense. And then I just lost my train of thought.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, reading the notes. I need to stop reading.
That's all right. That's okay. So real quick, right out of the gate, we did want to list some goals and sort of an outline of what we're going to talk about today. It's not going to be super formal, but we did want to say, regardless of whatever position that you have on this subject, if you even have one, we're not here to try and change your mind about whatever you feel about it. We're not going to argue that one position is better than the other. We might save that for our next episode because there's going to be a lot here. We might have to break it down into two parts. So we're not going to try to change your mind. Really, our only goal is to just articulate the discussion. We were just saying before we started recording how whenever we have conversations, either with individuals or even when we hear conversations from a group, the conversation goes all over the place because there's so many different directions that this topic can take. So the bulk of what we're going to be talking about are basically the main arguments for why the Church of the Nazarene has its position against alcohol, and then counter arguments. So have more of a dialogue with that. And throughout it, you'll kind of hear our personal opinions too. But I want to start by giving some background on why the Church of the Nazarene has its position on alcohol. And just want to say, currently, as the manual, which is the document that has our theology and doctrinal stances and all that, the position that claims is that to be a member of the Church of the Nazarene, you have to abstain from alcohol. It's essentially the same stance as we take with like tobacco and drugs. So that's the position for alcohol. It's like we don't drink. We don't encourage our members to. We actually say if you want to be a member, you can't drink. So, and it's changed over the years. I was reading a manual from the 60s. And that one had a really interesting line in it, which I'll pull up here in a second. But the reason why we have this, and again, it's other denominations too, but very briefly, when the Church of Nazarene started, it started during the American Holiness Movement. And the American Holiness Movement was motivated in part to be a force for transformation in the world, not just on the individual level, but also on a governmental level. Like they were very much motivated by this idea that we could help purge wickedness from the individual, but also from society. And so the way that ended up manifesting itself was a big push to get laws in place that were, I mean, it was essentially trying to legislate righteousness. And if you know your American history pretty well, you know that around that time of the American holiness movement, which was the late 19th century, early 20th century, we had the Prohibition. And the Prohibition was seen as a really major victory for the holiness movement and also the evangelical movement, because it was a way of saying, hey, we can actually get rid of, these evils in our society. All we have to do is make sure that certain laws are passed, and then people won't sin anymore. And one of the cultural sins, societal sins, at the time, as it was viewed, was alcohol. So that's part of the historical reason. Also, when the Church of Nazarene started, by and large, the churches were in the inner city. Part of the American holiness movement was a desire to get back to the roots of Christianity, which is helping, the least of these, helping those that are most vulnerable, which were prostitutes, drug addicts, alcoholics. And so, as uh, sort of a stance of solidarity, we said, you know what, these are people who are recovering from addiction. So just to help them maintain their sobriety, we're not going to engage in these activities, which included alcohol. We're not going to drink because our brother or sister over here might be struggling with it. They're trying to break free of addiction, so we're just not going to engage in it. So that's those two ideas are really the root of where this stance comes from. Obviously, it's persisted the last 100 years. Um, and interestingly enough, like I said, I was reading in one of the old manuals, and uh, um, I just wanted to read something that was written here. It's a section titled "Temperance and Prohibition," and it says this: "The Holy Scriptures and human experience alike condemn the use of intoxicating drinks as a beverage. The manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors for such purpose is a sin against God and the human race. Total abstinence from all intoxicants is the Christian rule for the individual, and total prohibition of the traffic in intoxicants is the duty of civil government." So that's a pretty powerful stance, especially for 1960, to say that.
I know.
Yeah. Especially making the claim that apparently the scriptures said that drinking alcohol was evil, and also it's the responsibility of the government to make sure that people don't drink. So that's sort of the background that the Church of Nazarene has to work with. Obviously, it's been reworked a little bit since then. We don't see it as an immoral substance. We'll get into that in a second. I just wanted to pause there and just say that's the background of the subject, the brief history of it. I don't know if you had anything to say about that. Or
No, it was really thoroughly researched, and the fact that you found that much is still mind-boggling to me because I did look and I didn't find a lot. I mean, I found some general stuff, like the high-level stuff, but I mean, just some of the positions and like finding that thing from the '60s, that manual from the '60s, is really interesting. I think you pointed out a couple really interesting ties to like the what was going on in society, and it's like the belief, like
Mm.
culturally, that yeah, it's the government's job to legislate this, and I don't want to get into politics. We did have one on that last time, but it's just very different than kind of how we've been recently. And I just want to point that out because I think it's going to bear some mentioning a little bit later as we kind of get into like the
Mhm.
nitty gritty of the actual
Yeah.
arguments themselves. That's okay.
So, yeah, I mean, there's so much still that could be talked about with that, but we obviously have to keep it moving. Maybe we could revisit this sometime and just talk about the history, because there's a lot of fascinating stuff there. But maybe you didn't know it, and I'm surprised by how many people don't know the history of why the Church of the Nazarene has this stance. Um, but there it is. But I did want to go over briefly some. I don't know what we'd call it. I guess I'll just say these are just de facto statements that we can make about the Church of Nazarene's current stance. So the current stance, as it is, we don't view. I'm saying we. I'm representing the Nazarene Church. We don't view that alcohol is itself immoral. In the past, that was the case. We don't hold that view anymore. Alcohol's it's just a substance. It's amoral, right? It's not good or bad. It's just a thing. We also uh, currently, as it's written in the Church of Nazarene's manual, and you can find it online, the description is actually very brief, both in its description of what our stance is and also the reasoning behind it. It's really not that well explained. I don't think it's explained at all, actually. It just says if you want to be a member, you have to abstain from alcohol. Like, I mean, that's pretty much it. That and you have to be against the sale and trafficking of alcohol, which is kind of a weird statement, but regardless. But we also hold, like, we do
Yeah.
recognize that the disciples drank alcohol, that Christ drank alcohol. I heard it argued before that no, that it was just grape juice back then. It's like, no, like, come on, this is a silly argument. We're fine saying that they drank because we also don't hold the idea that if you drink, you're an evil person, right? If someone drinks, it's not like your spiritual life is somehow compromised, right? Because if we want to say that, then we're going to have
Right.
to write off a lot of other Christians like Lutherans, Orthodox, Catholics, Baptists, Pentecostals, even. Like, we would have to see all of them
Exactly.
as lesser Christians because a lot of them are fine with drinking. It's not a doctrinal stance for them. Um, we
Yeah.
also, this
And
one
that's
I
a big
thought
deal
was
because that's like
interesting.
really contra to the
Yeah.
ecumenical movement. Oh, sorry.
No,
No, I
you're
didn't want
good.
to
You're
interrupt
good.
you, man. I just had a comment about that. I was going to say that's a really big. I think that argument, that point right there, is going to be really the crux of what we're talking about today. Because, like, when we decided to talk
Yes.
about whether it's wrong for a Christian to drink, and we wanted to use the Nazarene as a foundation, what you just said is really interesting. That you just said that alcohol inherently isn't wrong. Now we're talking about the action that you perform with said alcohol, and it's also interesting that they make the argument that you can still drink and be a disciple, and even a good one at that. Otherwise, you would, basically be going against the ecumenical movement, right? The contra the ecumenical movement of the 60s, where a lot of Christians and evangelicals
Mhm.
just we came under the banner of Christian rather than like Catholics and Protestants or whatever, and it became like a really big uniting thing. That's an important distinction, Ben, because that's going to really that and the history I think is really the fundamental undercurrent of our entire debate and every point that we're going to make. So I wanted to bring extra attention, not to interrupt you, but to simply just stress, like, hey, that this is a big deal. This is a really, really big deal because it's going to tell you how and where the Nazarene Church has based the argument, and how and where, if you're finding that in your personal life and you're going to have this discussion, you're going to have to base your justify yourself, like where you're going to have to go to do that. Does that make sense, Ben? And I think that transitions into your next point fairly well, actually.
Yeah, that does make sense. So the next point is, this was interesting. The more I looked into it, and I don't know if I read this somewhere. I think I did. I did a lot of reading before this and like a lot of old sources. But this stance, and we overtly mentioned this, I don't think I'm going against the grain by saying this, that the stance against alcohol is not overtly based in scripture. Like, we're not going to the Bible and saying, oh, the
Yep.
Bible says you can't drink, therefore that's our stance. The stance is much
Yep.
more nuanced, if I could say. So we don't make that argument. Obviously, by the manual reading I did from the 1960s, that was the claim they made, but it's just not true. Um, like, we readily acknowledge again that the disciples, even Jesus, the early church, they drank alcohol, and obviously it was fine for them. So that's
Mhm.
sort of just a starting point, right? Those are just base level things we can all agree on. It is what it is, right? Just as a matter of fact, right? Maybe that'll break down some common misconceptions that are out
Yes,
there. I think it does. So with that
it
being
does.
said, did you have anything else to say before we move on to the main segment of our conversation tonight?
The only thing I wanted to point out was in all the studies and all the pre-work we did, which wasn't, at least in terms of us discussing it like this, wasn't a lot, admittedly. I couldn't find anywhere that said that the Church of the Nazarene, after changing the definition of alcohol, like we just talked about, said that consuming alcohol is inherently a sin, right? As in it's
Mhm.
against the moral will of God. And I would assume that it can't be because they view alcohol as amoral, and they even say that there you can be a disciple of Christ and still drink, right? Would like is that the assumption?
Mhm. You know what? I'm gonna look that up right now,
Not to totally
just to make
derail us,
sure
but
I'm getting
I
my
think it's an important
definitions right.
distinction too, because I mean, you know, not to, well, I mean, it's kind of is what you do when you're discussing something, like when you're talking about a moral issue. Like for a Christian, like there's the morality of it, and then there's also the additional aspect of like, your morality is also based in what you believe sin and truth is, right? Like you can be presented with bad choices, doesn't mean that any of them are sin, versus like you can be presented with like a choice to sin or not. You know what I mean? Like it just depends on what it is, and what matters to you would be like how you. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm trying to think of a good example and I can't. Um, all I could think of is Sophie's Choice
Yeah.
as a reference, but that's not helpful for sin. Just know that adds an extra element of
Mhm.
evaluation when you're making moral, decisions. Is all I'm saying. Yeah.
So the actual stance that is listed in the manual is pretty interesting. So I won't explain how it's broken down. This is just how it is. We have the stance that we are against the use of intoxicating liquors as a beverage. So we're fine with cooking with alcohol, just not straight drinking it.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Giving influence to or voting for the licensing of places for the sale of alcohol, and then going on. I do find this wording interesting. In light of the Holy Scriptures and human experience concerning the ruinous consequences of the use of alcohol as a beverage, which is very different than saying in light of the Holy Scriptures concerning the use of alcohol, just concerning the ruinous consequences of alcohol. Just want to point that out. And in light of findings of medical science
Yeah.
regarding the detrimental effects, our position and practice is abstinence rather than moderation. So that's the reasoning given. It also goes on to say, Holy Scripture teaches that our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. So that sort of goes back to, alcohol does have detrimental effects on health. Um, so that's one of the reasons given for that. Um, and that's pretty much those are the
Interesting.
reasons given for for the position. So
No, it's really
which
interesting.
will
Yeah, because they
yeah,
didn't
which
say
will
sin, so I just
right, right. It doesn't say that. Really, the only sin being alluded to by the manual's definition is improper care of our bodies. That would be probably the closest you'd come to a moral uh, reasoning behind it. Like that's the basis, essentially. Um, and we'll get more into that in the arguments. But so that being said, the way we're gonna articulate the rest of this is we're going to go through various arguments. These aren't structured in any particular way. A lot of these are going to sort of dovetail into each other. So I apologize ahead of time if we end up repeating ourselves. But these are, again, the most common and really the only ones I could think of, the only ones I could find, arguments that people make for the position and the common counter arguments against that reasoning. So we'll just dive right in. Is that cool with you if we do that?
that works for me, man.
All right. So this one,
This is what I've been prepping for. This is what I've been excited for all day.
yeah, true. All right. So this is an argument that's pretty basic. It's the because I said so argument. So essentially, this one goes, you know what? This is just the stance that we have. This is the stance we've had for 100 years, and that's enough reasoning for why we have that stance. So that's essentially the argument. I don't know how you want to do this. If you want me to just read both and then we'll talk, or if you want
Yeah,
it to be one, I'll do the other. I don't know.
I'll do the counter argument. Well, I'll tell you what. Like, how about I do? How about I just give a comment about that argument as a positive argument, right?
Yeah, sure.
This actually was a fairly common Catholic argument from like for just like believing in the Catholic Church or taking anything they said as gospel up
Hmm.
through about the Reformation, so to speak. It was fairly common, like Augustine, and even to a lesser extent, Aquinas argued it in some ways, but particularly Augustine on the way they viewed history. So it's actually not totally out of left field. Uh, it's one of those things I think we as Americans,
Hmm.
because we're like all about our own freedoms and liberty, like really hate because like you're imposing your will on us, especially like when you get into like certain subsects of American culture where you're like, hey, that's an oppressive system. Maybe sort of you kind of join voluntarily, so you know sift through that as you will. But the whole
Yeah.
point is that it's not a terrible argument. It's not been used historically in churches, so I don't think we should just brush it
Mhm.
off as a oh, it's just like bad parenting. You know what I mean? No, the idea is that you believe in the
Yeah.
authority of the church and you've trusted and affirmed that their faith is there, so you can trust their judgment on this matter. Does that make more sense? I think that nuance is important, though. Of the because I said so argument.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it's not totally weak, but there is some the counter argument for it is, pretty strong, which is that it's I mean, that's a pretty arbitrary reason, right? Like, so okay, so why do you choose alcohol and not something else and just say, "Well, because I said so," right? Because we used to have the position that you couldn't go to circuses, you couldn't go to theaters, you couldn't go to, ballrooms specifically, I guess that was a thing. Like, that was a big concern for some people, like,
Well, is anything
but we
dancing,
changed
right? Any
those
place you
rules,
can
so then it
dance,
seems
right?
arbitrary that we're saying, "Yeah, so why don't we still have those?" And then say, "Well, because I said so." Because that was the position then, and there was good reason for it. So now we still have that position, right? So why this one,
Yeah,
right? And obviously, again, we could keep going through all the webbings and connections, and we'll get there. But we're just taking one argument at a time. Um, but I don't know if there's anything else to say
yeah.
about that one.
It is.
Pretty simple to understand.
I do have one little piece to add. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, because the whole thing, the counter argument to it is like, because the actual argument is like, trust us because of who we are. And the counter argument is like, yeah, I do trust you,
Mhm.
but I also want to know why I trust you. So it's almost question begging, and that, nah, that's the wrong word. It's almost funny because it just kind of like opens up the door for like questions like motivations and like the arbitrariness of it, if it is arbitrary, and it doesn't allow that discussion to be had. So I
Yeah,
don't know if arbitrary is the right word, as much as it's like it doesn't allow for like a kind of open disclosure in a relationship where it's
yeah,
asking you to trust them, if that makes sense. I don't know. I'm trying to be fair
yeah.
to both sides,
Um,
but I also think that it does fall a little short sometimes because, okay, trust you to do what?
Yeah. Well, and it's
Sorry. Anyway,
frustrating. I mean, this is essentially the reason that pastors are given by leadership, and I'm not trying to throw leadership under the bus at all, because they're in a tough position with this stuff. Like, they don't decide it.
yeah,
Um, a lot of them don't. But it is frustrating sometimes, like when I would talk with, people that are leaders to me, and I'd be like, "Hey, I have a church member that's asking about this position, and I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. And the reason I'm giving it is essentially, well, that's just because that's our stance." And I'm like, "Yeah, but to this person I'm trying to talk with, like, that's not good enough." Like, it to them, it doesn't hold water,
yeah.
like, then they
This,
really wanna know why, and I'm like, "I don't really have much of a reason to give them besides that, so what am I supposed to do?" Uh,
yeah. Then you make an
so
elaborate argument for trusting them, even though the whole point is they're trying to figure out if they can trust them. Like,
yeah, true.
anyway,
Yeah. Alright, so the next argument, this one is pretty common too, though it's not talked about that, uh well, how do I wanna say this? By people who understand the position pretty well, this one is very common, but a lot of other people sort of outside the circle don't know it. This is the historical argument, which is given the original reason for this position, we should continue to hold it, because we continue to encounter people who are recovering alcoholics, and whose sobriety could be compromised if we allowed alcohol in our churches. And I do know that there are people who have started attending a Nazarene church because of their position on alcohol, because that individual's background, they said, I can't be around it at all. And I'm uncomfortable going into churches where they're fine drinking at, their groups and potlucks and stuff, and they really struggle with that. So that would be more of the historical argument, which is, because we had the position before and the original reason was very good, that should be enough to carry through. It's pretty similar to the because I said so, but there's a little bit more backing to it, which is essentially,
is the
for the
argument that
sake
like
of my
culture
brother and
hasn't.
sister, I won't drink. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, you're good. Is the argument essentially then like, since like we haven't changed enough to merit, like our culture hasn't changed enough to merit changing our position, because like we're still battling, like we still think that sobriety is not compromised. You understand what I'm asking?
Mhm.
Like they're basically like, I don't know. I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out like the crux of the argument because it's so similar. I'm trying to what's the big distinction there? Because it doesn't
Um,
seem like it's like this is how we've always done it. So it's something, and that's what I'm trying to figure out, because this one I struggled with a
yeah.
little bit in prep.
Well, the because I said so, yeah. Well, the because I said so is basically just like just on the face of it. Not
Okay.
even giving a historical reason, just saying, "Well, that's our position, that's enough." The
Okay.
historical argument is actually giving a specific reason as to why, like trying to justify the reason why we have the stance. But you're right, and this sort of does go into the counter argument for the historical, which is that, doesn't that assume that culture hasn't changed enough to merit examining this, right? And maybe thinking, yeah, okay, that was the original context,
Hmm.
but does that really apply that much anymore, right? We do live like the last 100 years, things have changed a lot. And I mean, let's be honest here.
You
You
don't
can't,
say.
yeah, like you can't watch a TV show or a movie or just, go for a walk outside almost or go for a drive without being confronted with, an advertisement for beer or, watching people on a TV show drink wine. So is it really making that much of a difference to say, you know what, because I don't want someone else to be exposed to alcohol, then we just need to make a blanket statement that none of us will drink because it seems like they'll be exposed to it regardless. So does the historical
Hmm.
argument, does that really hold up nowadays? I'm summarizing that one. Um,
Yeah,
but
no, that's
yeah.
good.
But also like, other social evils, if you want to put it that way, have become more prevalent, but we don't have a position on those, like social media. I mean, that is like a drug to a lot of people, and it's just almost. I mean, you made some notes on this, so I'll hand it over to you. But if we're going to have a statement on the
Yeah.
stance of alcohol because of its consequences, then why haven't we sort of added to that list of other things that have developed in the last 100 years?
Yeah. I mean, there have been studies that show like the push notifications that you get on your phone to like see a notification or a like or a subscribe or whatever for a social media platform, which is ironic because we're asking you to subscribe at the beginning of this video, is addictive, right? Like that
Yeah.
feeling releases, it's like a trigger of endorphins, and it can be addictive in the sense that like you can want and chase that feeling. I think it's part of the reason that, and this is not a critique of Gen Z, but like some Gen Zers are having like higher rates of depression. It's because they spend all this time on their phone,
Mm.
and they like their entire life is in a device that's like, this big. It's not. I apparently got text
Yeah.
messages. I didn't get an endorphin rush when I got those because I didn't even know they were there. But like
It's
my
funny.
whole point is like their whole life is in this like, what is it, like 2 by 6 inch like device, 3 by 5 inch device or whatever. And that's not a critique of a generation
Hmm.
as much as I was saying like you're seeing high rates of depression because the thrill for them, the rush comes from them as response and some kind of vote from strangers. And it's like statistically, Gen Zers are more likely to believe that they're one video or one TikTok or one tweet away from becoming social media stars. And that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying like, if our argument is like like battling addictive substances, like then all churches, or at least the Nazarene church, ought to ban use of social media. But I'm 99% sure, like confident that every like Nazarene church out there has a Facebook page, and I don't mean that to be mean, but it's
Yeah.
and that's the thing is like you got to be in the world, not of it, and you got to like piecemeal that like what that means. But it just seems kind of interesting because I think that right now some of the biggest social ills that we've like are experiencing are because of things like social media, right? We have an entire generation depressed and anxious because they live through a screen. We have we have misinformation flowing out there and like political like just unrest in general because of that. I'm not trying to get into a specific side.
Mhm.
We already did that. We're not going to do that again. But my point is simply this: that this is a tool and a new invention, a creation of man that's become a problem. And it really, if you are looking at it from the lens that you're making the alcohol argument, I don't think that you can make that same argument for social media. So then it becomes really weird because that's the arbitrary point we made in the last argument. Like, why choose this but not that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Ben? Am I
Hmm.
articulating that okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Because no, you said it so well. I can't even say anything because you like just summarized it.
Sorry.
Which
I
is
just really like
exactly,
playing.
if alcohol, why not something else, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because that's the tricky thing. I mean, because you're right, like other things can end up destroying your life. Sometimes as much, if not more so than alcohol. You could be just as addicted to other things that aren't even mentioned
Exactly.
in the manual. But of course, the fallback is, right, so this is sort of the follow up, would be, you know what, you just need to exercise, general, just good discernment when in regards to those things, like social media. Like, don't, if you find yourself becoming addicted to it, take a step back, right? Practice discipline with it, stuff like that. And it's like, well, okay, that's totally reasonable. Why not have that approach with alcohol instead of just an outright uh, restriction of it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So,
Hmm.
yeah, and that's where you start going in circles, right? Um,
Yeah, it feels really inconsistent, and then it's hard to get a grip of like what like is it. It doesn't feel like a good reason at that point because it doesn't survive the truth test in terms of being consistent. You know what I mean? Like part of what we
yeah.
believe is to be true in life are things that we experience repeatedly or that make sense in lots of
Mhm.
situations. You know what I mean? Like that's how people tend to develop truth. That's how I tend to develop truth. I guess I should, or at least understand truth, I suppose. Anyway, that's getting into a whole other discussion. I won't get into that, but
Yeah,
yes, Ben, you said it really well. I just wanted to kind of chip in there. Sorry.
thanks. Yeah, I mean, this is a very popular argument, and I do think there's a lot of merit to it, though. Like examining the original context, and again, I'm surprised. And someone I made a Facebook post asking for people's feedback on this, and that was something that was talked about by a couple people. Was that
Yep.
the historical argument like that should carry some weight because that's a part of our history as a
It should.
denomination, and I don't think we should just outright discard. Uh, you know some of the main things that we were about when we started, and that should be taken into
Mhm.
account. That should be explained, just at the very least, to help people understand. This isn't an arbitrary position. There is a reason for it. At least in the original stance,
Yeah.
there's a reason for it, and it was a good reason. I mean,
Yep.
if the if we were doing the same thing today that we were back then, I think this is totally legitimate. That argument would be totally legitimate, of course, but also the church has changed. The Church of Nazarene is not just in the inner city anymore. We don't just work with people who are recovering alcoholics. We work with all kinds of people, and in some cases, some churches, alcohol is just not even a subject that's brought up because they're dealing with, very different issues that they're facing. So, how do you I don't know, how do you wrestle with that, right? But
Yeah, exactly. Like, where do you go? I put in the notes, Ben, you kind of brought it up, and I'll just kind of touch on it here because we'll touch on it again a little bit later. Some of the arguments, like, I feel like the stance would carry a little bit more credence if, like, every Church of the Nazarene was required to have like an AA, like, meet in their building. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Because then it would feel like
Mhm.
more of like a consistent stance, like they're still actively trying to address that specific evil, and that to me would stand out. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And in fact, I'm pretty sure AA is technically was started by a Catholic group. I don't know that for certain, or like implies. I don't know. I feel like there's a tie with Catholicism in there, but my point is simply this: like, I don't feel like it's still being addressed in that same way. So, like, the argument is solid. Like, it really gives a solid reason why, but it just feels like it feels dated, and unless we kind of update it, I feel like it's missing a couple things. I don't know. I don't know how you feel about that as a unique talking point, but you brought it up, so I just wanted to riff.
Yeah, and that's another, pretty serious blow to the historic argument is that it also not only does it not really factor in that culture itself has changed, it also doesn't really factor in uh, the reality that the Church of Nazarene has changed,
Mm,
um,
that's
in how
interesting.
we practice, in our uh, maybe our goals. We say that they're the same, but in practice, our goals can be very different now. um, where it seems to be more, geesh, I don't want to say too much because I'm talking about a denomination that's across the globe, but one that seems more interested in mission, reaching everyone, not just people who are, the most at risk. And that requires, a lot of creativity
Sure.
and branching out into very different areas, not just, you know, the addicts and the alcoholics and the prostitutes, but, all walks of life. And I don't know if this really takes that into account seriously. Um,
Yeah.
so, but it is, it's an argument. So I don't want to beat that one too much. The next argument
Yeah.
is this is one that I always heard a lot growing up. And I reached out to a good friend of mine who said this was the one he always heard. This is the witness argument. The argument goes like this: that as Christians, if we drink alcohol, it negatively affects our witness, and so we'll be seen as giving into what secular culture has already compromised on, and so we need to have this position against alcohol, and we need to uphold that so that we can actually be people who are set apart, that our lives do look different, because if we start looking like everybody else, then it's going to be seen as, you know, so what's so great about Christianity when you're living just like just like the rest of us, right? Or someone could even look at you who's a non-Christian, might look at a Christian who drinks and says, "Oh, I guess you're not really as holy as, you say you are, or you're not as good as
Yeah.
whatever." That's the witness argument. I feel like I already started undercutting it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe you didn't. I don't know. I from I don't know. It's not terrible. Like, to be fair, like the
Mhm.
idea, like when you do drink, depending on how much alcohol you have had, you do function less effectively. I don't think anybody
Mhm.
who's drank that can argue that. Like, it's true. So maybe like having that like soberness in terms of like that quick mind. Like, there's a reason in the biblical language they talk about like being like trustworthy. They use like language of like sober minded, like calm. You know what I mean? Less reactive. And that's what alcohol does, right?
Mhm.
It lowers your inhibition. So in that sense, like maybe you would be better at witnessing in the sense like you don't say that comment, that critical thing that could be negative because it's, on the tip of your tongue. It's more of like oh, okay. Like I'll hold my tongue here and maybe pick my spots a little better, so to speak, if that makes sense to you. So like, I don't know. I don't want to like totally
Yeah.
undercut. I don't think you're totally undercutting your argument. Like there is some amount to like be said about that. It just I think it just gets a little weird because they kind of undercut their own argument by saying like, well, you don't have, even if you do drink, you're not any less of a believer. So I don't know. The witness argument seems kind of interesting because, like, I don't know.
Obviously, everyone's a little different, but every time I've heard this argument, it's almost like it's assumed that, okay, like if you drink, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't make you any less of a believer, but it can negatively affect your image and how others perceive you. And so it's sort of weird. It's almost like it assumes that drinking alcohol is fine. It's just, but you don't want other people to gossip about you. Um, and that's where the weakness of this argument, I think, lies. Um, because it's really just about saving face then. And it's like, why do that? Because someone might have a negative opinion of me if I do this. Well, so what? Like someone's going to have a negative opinion of something else I do. Like I've had people who had a negative opinion of me because I wore jeans and a sweater when I preached one day. Like so what? Like no matter what you do, people are going to be critical of something, And like, well, especially, and I also feel like the
Heathen.
only people who would be really
Jesus.
Yeah, no. Well, okay, so funny story, I went to a
Sorry.
lunch after,
I couldn't help but
no,
laugh.
it's fine. I gotta tell this story because it's great. So I went to a luncheon, a public luncheon at a local church after I preached one Sunday. It was just right down the street from my church, so I went there. There was a couple I was sitting next to at the table who attended another church, and, we were just talking. I was like, "Oh, how was your Sunday morning? Blah, 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 blah," and they're like, "Oh, it's really good." And sheesh, I don't know how we got on the subject, but they just said, I mean, we're just so tired nowadays of like people who, I mean, like you really have to have dignity, when you're up there in the pulpit. They didn't know I was a pastor. And they says, I mean, we just love seeing our pastor in a suit and tie and preaching up there. Like, man, we just can't stand it when people just preach in jeans and a sweater. And I just looked down at myself and I looked up and I looked at him and I legit just said, oh man, that's what I wore when I preached today. And they didn't say anything else the rest of the meal. It was kind of awkward. So yeah, so this argument it's also weird in another way because, and tell me your experience because maybe yours is very different than mine, but I feel like the only people who would look at a Christian drinking and think, "Oh, they must not be a Christian," are would be other Christians. Like I don't know of any non-Christian who would see a Christian drinking and say, "Oh, well, I'm not gonna like Christianity is just a bunch of crock then if they're drinking and it's fine." Like I
I mean,
I feel like only
yeah.
Christians say that.
Yeah, you'd have to believe A, that drinking was like wrong inherently, which I just don't know a lot of people that
Mhm.
hold that position. I don't know if that's a realistic position to hold.
Yeah.
So I don't
Well, at
know.
least
It's
not
just tough for me to
anymore.
navigate.
Yeah.
No, like I don't like
Yeah.
not
And maybe
I
that sort of
I've
touches on
never
the
had anybody
historic
like that.
argument because yeah. Yeah. And again, so I think that sort of
Yeah, I
goes
get it
back to the
has to.
historic argument because back then, like it was like the popular social idea was that alcohol was bad. And so if Christians were drinking, like it was seen as like, oh, like that's a bad thing. You can't do that. But nowadays, culture just does not have that view. And so if we're already uh, um, assenting to the fact that alcohol itself is not immoral, then what's the real barrier there, except for again just trying to save face. But also, um, if we want to be sensitive, all right, so let's take this argument a little bit more, well, at least for myself, a little bit more seriously. um, all right, let's assume that someone who's a non-Christian looks at you, and like you are a Christian and you're drinking, and they look at you and they say, oh well, I thought Christians were supposed to be about something, and alcohol is like obviously bad, and yet you're drinking, so Christianity must not be legitimate. Like, if we start conceding to everyone's sensitivities according to what they perceive a Christian should be, let's just be honest, that's gonna get out of control real quick, because I've met a lot of non-Christians who have really weird ideas about what Christians should and shouldn't do. like it's nuts. Like, I've had people who are surprised that I play with a stack of cards sometimes, like not poker, like with money or anything. Like, just like even just go fish. Like, people are shocked that I do that. And I'm not even talking about old people. Like, some young people just have this idea of what they think Christians are supposed to be, and like it's nuts. Like, I watched the John Wick movies, and people, I remember a conversation I had, someone thought I
Heathen.
was somehow going against my faith because I was watching it. Yeah, or something like that. Or, I watched Harry Potter, so I guess that means I'm a heathen now too, according to some people. So like, if we want to be sensitive to everyone's perception of what's Christian and not, like, that's we're going to be schizophrenic. Like, you just can't do that. And also,
We're gonna have a stay-at-home
like,
order
those
because we're gonna
opportunities
get
though.
bad.
Yeah, no kidding. Um but also, those opportunities allow for conversation. Like, it actually opened the
It's
door to be
true.
like, you know what, let's actually talk about that. Like, is that a Christian position or not? Like, let's explore this. Is this immoral or not? Like, watching Harry Potter, does that mean I support witchcraft? Well, no. Let's talk about it. Um, so yeah, the witness argument is weird. Also, something pointed this out, which is uh that having a stance against alcohol actually, in many cases, can close the door to potential or even current relationships, because it's seen as a holier than thou thing. Oh, you must think you're better than me because you don't drink. Well, then I'm not going to be around someone that just thinks they're better than me. Um, and I do think that can be a
Can
sentiment
I
felt by
share?
a lot of people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
can I share an anecdote?
yeah.
So I guess this will be the time that we tell where we're at. I do drink, and I have friends that don't necessarily not drink. They just don't. I don't know. They're kind of on the fence. They kind of sometimes drink, sometimes they would like just don't, and it's hard to tell. But it's really
Hmm.
hard when we hang out because, like, if we want to go out to a restaurant, like Morgan and I really like to go to craft breweries. We live in Colorado, especially in the Denver area, and craft brewing is a big deal. Like, it's a huge thing for our economy. It's really a lot of fun. You go taste a bunch of different microbrews. You don't even have that much. You just get like a flight, and you get like 3 or 4 of these like 3 ounce little things, and like that's events that we can't have. So it's weird because like we can go out to dinner and stuff, but it doesn't you don't get the like the fun kind of go hang out, like let your hair back, go to B-dubs, watch a game kind of experience. And I know that doesn't seem like a
Hmm.
whole lot. And maybe it sounds like we drink too much. I don't know. But either way, like the my argument is that there is a little bit of like a weirdness to it. Socially, it just feels kind of like, oh, well, what do you why not? Should I not do it in front of you? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I wanted to go have a beer with my burger. Is that, can I not do that? And it just like it leaves like a weird, I don't want to say a taste in your mouth, but it confuses you a little bit. You just feel a little less decided. Does that make sense, Ben? Am I sharing a story that makes any sense to you? I don't know how to share my experience in a way to articulate it, because I didn't look down on them because they're longtime friends, but it just makes it a little more confusing, or sometimes it's not as, I don't know, easy to pick a place. Whereas like I have some other friends, like, what we'll do is we'll usually go down somewhere to go downtown. We'll catch a baseball game and we'll meet at a bar beforehand, have a beer, then maybe have one at the game and call
Hmm.
it a day or whatever. It just kind of feels like a thing. It's like a social like event. It's like a place you go.
Yeah.
And I guess since we've already argued that it's not morally wrong, it's just a fun choice that we make. But the holier than thou thing, I don't know if I would say I felt that as much as I felt like I don't know, like how do you feel about me doing it? Should I not do it? And maybe that's the insecurity of holier than thou. But there's another argument to
Mm.
be made that like by not being able to do those things, it'd be really difficult to go to those places, or not illogical to go to those places. So you might miss out on building opportunities with those people for the people that you're allegedly trying to minister to. But I think that's a fairly weak argument on my part. Does that? I don't know. I'm getting way ahead of myself. Does that make sense though, Ben? What I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it does. And you're right. A lot of that does come down to like our personal interactions. I know a lot of people haven't experienced that. Um, but I know I have too. Like I've had people talk to me and like even overtly say things like, "Oh, you must think you're better than me then," and like feel offended that I don't drink. And I'm like, "No, like
Yeah.
I'm not saying I look down on you. Like that's just my stance." And but some people get offended by that. So it's like, okay, is that is that one of those things where I'm just like shake it off and it's like, you know what, just whatever. Um, or does that, necessitate maybe this is something that should be examined? Like, so I'll give an anecdote myself, and I don't know, I might get in trouble for this. But when I was a pastor, well, I am, but when I was a pastor of a church, um, it was a very small town. There were like three businesses in the downtown that were not related to well, all in all, the town I lived in only had 7 businesses total. One of them was a gas station and sort of a quick mart. Another one was the post office, if you want to count that, but whatever. The other one was a bar. And I remember one of the first village meetings I went to, the guy who owned the bar was trying to get his liquor license. And at the meeting, they were discussing, should we approve this or not? And one of the board members looked at me and he says, "Hey, aren't you the new pastor at the Nazarene church down the street?" I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, so I don't know what ordinance it was, but they made mention to something about you can't have a bar within certain number of feet of a church. I don't think this situation fell in those parameters, but regardless, he looked at me and said, "Are you comfortable if we approve like the liquor license for this guy to open up his bar?" And I guess according to the manual, I should have said no, but I actually said, "Yeah, I think that's fine." Um, because like he was, supporting himself, but he was also like it was a small town. Like that was one of the only businesses that was there. Um, and it was sort of a weird position I was in because I could have just shut down the whole thing and been like, no, and then that bar would have never opened. But also, once that bar opened, we had a day where as a church we put together gift baskets for the different businesses. There was a guy in the church who brought one to the bar, and these gift baskets were just our way as a church of saying, you know what, we appreciate that you're here, we appreciate that you contribute to our our neighborhood, and we just want to show our appreciation for who you guys are. The guy who took it to the bar came back to me like that evening. Actually, he was like really excited to do it. Came back to me that evening, and he was just like beside himself because he took it to the bar, and he says the way they reacted, it was like if you'd given them $1 million. Like they could not believe that the church down the street like appreciated them, and they were just so overjoyed, and they were like so grateful. They were like, "Man, like that's awesome! Like thank you so much. That means, a lot to us because it's a small town. They struggle to be in business. Or just like it just means a lot that a church that you guys would say that." And actually later on that year, so each year this bar does a raffle, a Christmas raffle, and that year the bar owner came to me and says, "You know what? Like, we really believe in what you guys are doing as a church. Like, we really appreciate that you guys obviously care about the community, like you're involved, like you're getting outside the church. We love that, and we want to support you. So all the proceeds that we are taking in for the raffle, we're going to give to the church.
Oh my
The only thing we
goodness.
ask is that you put it back into the community through like some sort of initiative or action or whatever. Just keep doing what you're doing," is what they said. So New Year's Eve, I go in to pick up, the money that they got from this raffle. And like once I walk in, like there's people who look at me and they're like, "Hey, it's Pastor Ben, hey everyone, it's Pastor Ben." And they're like, all cheering me. And it was sort of awkward that this Nazarene pastor was getting cheered at a bar. Um, some guy came up to me and like offered to buy me a drink, and I was like, "No, no thanks. I
Sorry.
actually don't drink." But
Uh, get fired, but appreciate
no,
that.
it's fine. But I
Yeah.
mean, Yeah, but I mean, that's one of those situations that always made me think, and I'm like that actually opened a lot of doors for the church and the community because we didn't just shut the door on what they were doing. Um, and like I didn't drink or anything throughout that process. Yeah, I went against the manual and said I'm fine with them getting their liquor license and I'm fine with what they're doing as a business. Even though they're a bar, but like there are people I met there that I never would have met any other way. And it was obvious to me that they already felt judged by the church. So it's not like our position was going to do anything. In fact, because of that, we were able to develop, a pretty good relationship with those people. So all that to say, this whole witness argument is, uh, I think it's a really weird one to make because, again, you could make just as many arguments of how having this position actually closes doors and doesn't allow us to witness. And actually, sometimes having this stance is can hurt our witness as Christians because it sort of blocks off some of those relationships. So
That's a really
that's my
good story,
story.
man. Yeah, no, I think it's good. I
Thanks.
think we both illustrated some points about it. I hope we haven't totally undercut the argument, but anyway, do you want to move on to the next one then?
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of these arguments are stronger than others. The next one, I can move down here. So the next one is the addiction or alcoholism argument. This
Mm.
one is pretty common. So because the repercussions of alcoholism are disastrous, and they are, I don't know of anyone who is going to argue that alcoholism is fine. But because alcoholism is so destructive, the argument is therefore we can't support the act or the habit that leads to alcoholism. And that's pretty much the crux of that argument. And I think there's some reasoning behind it. But again, it sort of goes back to the whole, okay, well then why not do that with everything else? Right? Why not just take the moderation approach? I mean, if you're afraid of someone getting addicted to something and the destructive results of it, then ban social media, sort of like what we already said. Sorry,
Can we
go ahead.
just lump that in with the next one, the gateway argument? Because I think that these two are so close that it'd be easier to talk about both of them simultaneously. Because we've touched on them a little bit, but just to take care of them all at the same time, if that's all right.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to touch on that one?
Sure, yeah. So the gateway argument is that alcohol is a gateway drug and it can easily lead to more serious or harmful substances. So not necessarily that you'll be addicted to it. It could be uh, alcohol. I'd be an alcoholic, but it could even lower your inhibition to try other things. So uh, alcohol use is linked to
Mm,
domestic violence and abuse, not necessarily as a result of being inebriated, but it is linked in some way. So I basically I think both arguments are in some ways are slippery slopes. I don't know how you feel about that, Beats,
yeah.
but I feel like they're both slippery slope arguments. So I mean, I guess the counterpoint to both would be the moderation argument versus the gateway argument. Like the gateway is slightly different for a counterpoint. I would argue if I was arguing against it, I would say like, a gateway drug can be used for many things and it really depends on the individual. And that's kind of the whole idea of discernment and self control. Moreover, I don't really know if there's a lot of research that supports gateway drugs as an argument. That was more of like, from my understanding, it was more of like a social thing. And just
Mm,
I'm going to admit something to you all because I want to make sure that I'm being fair in my analysis. I'm extremely skeptical of any slippery slope argument anywhere. I really hate
mm,
the like don't set a precedent and then like everything is taken case by case. Our judicial system works that way. Like you know what I mean. Like the precedent is because this is why it's legal. But like the slippery slope arguments, like for like anything else, just are really frustrating because like what Ben said, like you can practice and you can hit the brakes, right? It's not like the brakes don't work, so to speak. You can stop. It's just whether you choose to or not. So I think the only way you could get really like to
mm,
push these arguments forward for like not wanting to touch anything that could lead to addiction, whether it be alcohol or something stronger as a gateway to something stronger and even more destructive, allegedly. I don't know. I think they're all pretty equally destructive. I think we're kind of splitting hairs at that point. Um, I think you'd have to make
yeah.
a really, really strong case for human depravity and like our lack of choice, or our consistency in choosing the wrong thing,
Mm,
which might be something you could make. I feel like it's a little bit, in some ways, a bit at odds with our optimism as Wesleyan Arminians. I don't know that definitively, but that seems
mm,
more like a traditional Reformed, specifically a Calvin, like a 5 point Calvinist argument for like the human nature and like not
Yeah.
being able to control oneself, because the presence of the Holy Spirit, one of the fruits would be self-control. I don't know, we're getting into like the weeds, but does that make sense, Ben? Like that's why I wanted to lump them together, because I feel like they're just two
Mhm.
sides of the same coin,
Yeah. Yeah, there was one part of this that I wanted to draw attention to.
Sure, sure.
Several years ago, there was actually a panel discussion at a Nazarene conference about alcohol, and long story short, the whole thing was a mess. It was really poorly put together, and the panelists were not very good, except for one guy, uh, uh, James Koppel. I tried to reach out to him to get some information, but I think he's uh, on vacation right now, so I couldn't get it. But he actually made the argument of how alcohol is linked to domestic violence and abuse. He used a lot of statistics, he used a lot of data. It was actually a very compelling argument for a position against alcohol. I was very impressed by it. Um, and so I do think you could make this argument in a compelling way, but you just have to do it right. But that being said, that I think is the only strength that this argument has, is that alcohol use compared to using other substances tends to lead to certain types of abuse, um, and and destruction, and like we have statistical data to back that up. I think that's pretty compelling myself. Is it
Mm.
compelling enough to want to dismiss other arguments and just say no, that's enough to keep the our current position? I don't know, but it is a pretty powerful argument nonetheless. So that's the only thing I want to call out on that one.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah. And so somewhat related, but again, all these are somewhat related to each other. The next one is the time, money, and health argument. So this one essentially says alcohol does not contribute anything positive to our health that can't be addressed by something else.
That's
So I know some people make the argument, oh, well, I drink wine for the antioxidants, which is really the polyphenols, polyphenols. I don't know how to pronounce it, but you can get that same thing from like dark chocolate, coffee, tea, certain fruits and vegetables, or even just plain grapes. You don't need alcohol for that. So any health benefit you could get from something else, but also there's nothing positive gained money wise or time wise. In fact, it only carries potentially negative effects for all of those. So that's the time, money, and health argument. So that's why we have the stances, because I mean, there's just nothing really good about this, anyways. So pretty basic. I do think there is some legitimacy to that, though.
Oh, it's a hard argument to argue when you're talking about your own physical health. The
Yeah.
irony is that, like, school lunches, McDonald's, counterpoints are my counterpoints. You know what I mean? Like, we have an access to a lot of things. One thing that was really interesting though is like coffee. I think you could
Mhm.
make an argument for coffee being the same time, money, and health. Like, coffee is fairly expensive if you get it, if you buy it. Even beans, like good quality beans, are fairly expensive. Um, it just raises your anxiety level. The caffeine does. It just stimulates you. It's a stimulant. It's like it's a drug. Caffeine's a
Mhm.
drug. And you don't drink
Yeah.
coffee. I mean, I drink coffee for taste, but I started because I drank it for the caffeine, and now I just enjoy the taste. I think a lot of people have the same experience with alcohol.
Yeah.
They drink it for the drunkenness. So I don't know. It's an interesting little thing because we don't do it there. We do it here. But you're right. Like, just generally, like, it is worse for your health than coffee would be. And generally it would be difficult. So I think this is probably the strongest argument
Yeah.
so far. Not if I'm evaluating, not that any of them are like terrible. I don't really think that we
Yes.
think that,
Yes. So
but
far.
this one's it is strong. Like, it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, can't argue with that. It's not really
Yeah.
addressed at all by the
But
church.
then,
It's just a common
yeah,
argument, but it's a good one.
true. Yeah. But then it's also, yeah, the counter argument though is also, well, like, there's a lot of other things that are negative for us too, like fast food, fried food items, sugary drinks, candies. Like those aren't at all good for us.
Yeah.
And like actually, the common uh, counterpoint to this is, well, what about gluttony? Like how many unhealthily obese people are in our churches that just overindulge in unhealthy foods and are suffering from negative side effects, like health side effects of that. And it's also expensive to live that way. So if we're gonna use this argument for alcohol, then we should be using it for those things too. And I do think that's a legitimate counter argument. Um, and actually, overall, this argument is pretty much the Mormon position. So Mormons, I gotta, I gotta, I gotta give credit to the Mormons, because their position, like this is their position on substances that can affect how you think in your body. So they actually take a pretty strong stance. Like they don't drink, they don't for the time, money, health reason, but they do extend that to other things like fast food, like fatty foods. They extend it to coffee. Like they don't drink coffee, they don't drink soda. Um, so I mean, they follow it through to the end, and I got to give them credit for that. Like they follow it to its conclusion. Whereas in Church of Nazarene, when this argument is made, I don't think we do. If this argument's made, I don't
Right.
think we really follow it through. So we sort of undercut it in that way. Like if we really did take it seriously because of the health reasons, then we should be taking other things seriously as well.
Ben, would you
All
do
right.
this argument? Because this one I read a couple times, and I don't know if I could articulate it super well, and I feel like you might be able to, because when I was reading it, I heard your voice in the notes.
Oh. Okay, cool.
That's not a bad thing. I just
Yes.
heard it.
Yeah. So this is the floor and ceiling argument. Essentially, this argument it goes like this. We understand that there's a certain standard for Christian living. The issue that we come across is that that standard of Christian living is seen as the goal instead of like the ceiling, right? Like that is what we attain to do, right? Like loving our brothers and sisters, being kind, being gracious, forgiving, all of that. That's we see that as the goal when really it's the foundation. Like that's the starting point for what we should be as Christians. Um, but it's not the ceiling. Like we should be striving for greater things. We should be striving to live by a higher standard, and that requires a cost. So if becoming a member of the Church of Nazarene costs us nothing, then what worth is there?
Hmm.
So abstention from alcohol is one of the only things that the Nazarene Church requires that actually costs something beyond what's considered the standard form of Christian living. And because we're all held to a higher standard, that's going to require some sort of cost. So that's the floor and ceiling argument.
It's an interesting argument.
Yeah.
I think it's actually one of the better ones. The one thing I still feel like is really hard though is like by affirming that there are disciples and even strong disciples that do drink. I just like I think it's just kind of hard to be like higher standard. Higher standard to what? Like what is the standard not drinking? Like, but why is that standard there? I think that's
Mhm.
really where it's like if we're gonna try to pick the argument apart, like I would start going. Um does that make sense? You know what I mean? Like not that it's not a terrible argument. It's really not. Like I don't want it to seem like wow, like oh this is stupid. It's not. It's a good argument. Like if you're called to be set apart, be set apart. And it really like what you're right.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to join a church that's going to try to do that, like and it doesn't cost you anything, what do you actually like that? They're not even living up to their own claim.
So it is interesting in that regard. Like, would we really want to join a church that doesn't challenge us? You know.
Yeah.
Um, so I do think there's some credit to that, but of course, to counter that, calling other people to live to a higher standard, it doesn't necessitate such a strong position. Um, and
Yeah.
also, I think it wrongfully assumes that the standard of Christian living is somehow easy and it comes as a default for Christians
Hmm.
when really like loving people and showing grace and forgiveness, like that's hard. Like that can take a lifetime to do. So is that really, should that be the floor? Like, should that be just a given that, well, that's where all Christians are. So we should be striving for something greater than that? Or should we recognize, what, actually, that's pretty challenging in and of itself. So maybe we shouldn't just assume, once you're a Christian, you're somehow perfect in all those aspects. So maybe this is going a bridge too far.
I don't know.
So one other part about this, and then we'll actually have to wrap up this episode. We'll continue it next time. But I did find this interesting. So the argument that is often given as scriptural support for the stance on alcohol is this. It's the context where Paul is talking to the church in Corinth, and they had an issue back then of when you'd go to the market and you would buy meat, or if you'd go to someone's house and they were serving meat, a lot of times that meat would have been sacrificed to idols or pagan gods. And a lot of Christians saw that as a problem. They were like, well, if I eat meat, then if it was sacrificed to an idol, does that mean that I'm worshiping that pagan deity? And Paul's argument was basically, well, actually those gods don't exist. So eat whatever food's put in front of you and just don't even worry about it. Like it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
essentially. But he did go on to say, but we do recognize there are people in the church who might not understand that, and so they're going to struggle if they see you eating meat that might have been sacrificed to an idol, and that might cause them to stumble and be like, "Oh, well, I guess we can do that, so I'll just start participating in pagan practices." So Paul said, "You know what? For their sake, if that's going to be a situation, then don't eat meat sacrificed to idols." So that was the argument for the position on alcohol, which is for the sake of our brothers and sisters, we don't want them to stumble, so we're not going to drink. Here's the problem I have with that defense, though. What Paul is arguing is that we should be considerate of our circumstances, and we should be considerate of the people that we might have an influence on, and take that into account and take some responsibility for, the sort of standard that we set and the lives that we lead, and how that's perceived and all that, which is totally legitimate. What he's not arguing is, you know what, some people are going to struggle with the whole meat thing, so we're just going to ban eating any meat just to relieve this issue. But that's not what he did. So actually, that argument ends up undercutting itself because it's actually stripping Paul's argument out of context. When if we did want to follow like what he's actually saying there, then our position would be when it comes to alcohol. If
Not,
you're working with people who are struggling with alcohol, then don't do it.
yeah.
Like that would be more in line with the spirit of Paul's message. Paul didn't just outright ban it. He says, no, actually take some responsibility for this. And so when we have this position, we're actually absolving the individuals from having to actually consider the effects of their actions, which I actually think is a misstep. When we should be calling people to be like, no, be considerate of how you're living.
That
So
is a really interesting argument, Ben. That is good. Huh. It never occurred to me by doing that and just doing a hard no, you might be enabling people to be less. Because, like, obviously, in the case of meat or no meat, one side technically wins and the other one has to just kind of deal. But you're enabling one side in some sense to, like, not have to be considerate, like allowing them to continue to just get their
yeah,
way. That's super interesting.
some food for thought. So with that being said, we do have a couple more arguments. One of them is the legal argument. This is a
Mhm.
pretty fascinating one, and
So,
also maybe a little boring for some people. Yeah, and the last one is the global church argument. So that one is probably my favorite, the one that I think has the most teeth. But we'll explain that. We'll dive into it next time, and then we'll also go into, so what do we do? Right now that we've set the stage of the conversation, where do we go from here? Should we change the policy? Should we keep it the way it is? We'll talk about all that next time. In the meantime, if you like this episode, like it. If you want to share it, which we encourage you to, please share it with your friends. We'd love to hear your comments, so reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, PB&J Podcast. Other than that, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.